So, good morning. Fortunately, we now have the pictures, so now we can start. To use that terrible slogan from exhibiting, where you're supposed to start everything with the purpose of this exhibit. Well, the purpose of this talk, presentation, discussion originated from some conversations between Marianne Bowman, who's familiar to you all, and myself, talking specifically originally about Milcopex and then talking about World Series shows in general. Many shows in the last few years have talked about their own specific issues, their own specific problems, and they kind of talk as if their problems are unique, whereas really there are kind of some general issues which affect more or less all of the WSP shows, not all, but many of them. And one of the difficulties that we have today is people don't really talk about the problems. They like to say everything is wonderful and everything is full steam ahead, but there are, looking forward, a number of issues which we have to consider. And the world has changed, the world has evolved, and as shown on slide here, many of the WSP shows are under stress, they're under pressure from different directions. If you look at the organizers and the volunteers who are working at these shows, they're getting older. If you look at the Milcopex committee, many of them are in their mid-80s. We also have an evolving stamp market. An important component of the shows used to be the dealer's bourse. The stamp market has changed. There are fewer collectors today than there were 30, 40 years ago. There are fewer attendees at shows than there were. Another issue which will impact the WSP shows currently and in the years to come, the aging of the dealers. The dealers themselves are getting older. And as much of the marketplace has transitioned online, many of them are likely to feel that they no longer need a booth at a show. We also, for the first time in 40 to 50 years, have a significant inflationary environment. Venues, hotels, convention centers are asking for higher and higher prices. Depending on your perspective, the inflationary environment is probably not going to disappear for a while. Prices are going to continue to increase. This puts many of the, especially some of the smaller shows, under pressure. From the exhibiting point of view, we see a fairly limited population of exhibitors. We see almost each and every show as it's coming up, a request, an email from APS. This show is short of exhibitors. This show needs exhibitors. This show needs exhibits. And whilst it used to happen once in a while, now I don't say it's an always event, but it is happening more and more frequently. One of the many elephants in the corner of the room is cost, frame fees. The frame fees, although some might argue they're expensive, they really do not cover the real costs of hosting the competition. And, you know, some of the costs are obvious, but some of them are more subtle. But the bottom line is the frame fees do not really cover the real costs of hosting the competition. And on a practical level, most shows are dealing with frames from 40 years ago. Many of them are the old Milcopex 1986 frames. Many of those frames are showing their age. They're difficult, they're expensive to replace. And when many of those frames break, there is not a pool of replacements waiting in the wings. So what do? You have aging frames that are heavy, awkward, difficult for people in their 80s to assemble. And eventually when they break, what do? We had a situation, and Ken probably remembers this from New York, when the Postal Service managed to trash the ASDA frames. And at the time to replace them, and I believe it was about 20, 25 years ago, it was something like $30,000 to replace those frames. And although some dealers offered to chip in, there was no way within a reasonable budget of being able to replace those frames. And that was one of the several factors that closed out exhibits at the shows in New York City some years ago. Now, taking some of these issues into mind, we want to have sustainable shows. How do we, or how could we make shows sustainable 5 years from now? Not next year, not necessarily the year after, but looking more to a longer term situation. Now, the whole idea of the WSP shows and the C of Cs and all of this was something that really was set up decades ago, really back in the 60s and 70s, when we kind of had the boom period of peak philately. And really, what were the two key components of those shows? It was the dealer bourse and a display of competitive exhibits. Now, today, we're increasingly reliant on the serial exhibitors, the person who sends their exhibit to show after show after show after show multiple times a year. And we don't have a limitless supply of exhibitors. But the exhibitors are not the only people who really have a stake in the game. There are really 3 or arguably 4 stakeholders: the organizers, the dealers, the exhibitors, the visitors. And actually, Marianne raised a very interesting point. There's the collector. He's not an exhibitor. He's not really a casual visitor, but he's a collector. So, you know, Marianne rightly pointed out there probably are 5 stakeholders. But let's take a look at some of these stakeholders and some of their perspectives. You know, from the organizer's perspective, what are they all about? What makes a show successful from the organizer's perspective? Well, it could be, well, we had more people came this year. Attendance was up. It could be, wow, we sold 3 more tables for the show this year. We had more dealers in attendance. And it could be as simple as, well, actually, we made money or we covered our costs. From some of the organizers, it's, well, you know, we really don't mind doing all this hard work. We don't mind all those committee meetings we have to sit through and all the discussions and making a budget. And really, we don't mind standing there putting frames up at 8 o'clock at night on a Thursday to get the show ready to open on Friday morning. We don't mind that hard work. Depends on your perspective. Now, there's another argument. Maybe it's just a service to collectors. You know, the local stamp club, we do the show for the members of the club. We do it for the collectors in our state, or we do it for the collecting community in general. So, you know, the organizers have a series of perspectives. They have a degree of interest in the thing, in the shows. But they don't always look at things perhaps as objectively and as broadly as they should. There's always the rhetorical question, well, why do we even have a show? And I think sometimes the shows just carry on because, well, they've always had a show. They've had a Milcopex for 10 years, for 20 years, for 30 years, and they just keep it going. The organizers don't always actually stop and say, well, we have Milcopex in September. Well, what happens before our show? What happens after our show? What are the other events taking place in the country over the course of the 12 months? Does our show fit logically within the annual calendar events? Well, we've always had it in September, so we've got to have it in September. Well, maybe September isn't necessarily the best time for it. They also don't necessarily consider, what does their show provide for the public? What does their show actually do to promote philately and stamp collecting? Do they really consider the public? Do they consider the visitor? Do they consider the collector? That separate category that Marianne rightly pointed out this morning. And if they have a youth or a beginner area, how do they chart the success of it? How do they evaluate whether that area is successful, productive? Is it justified? How do they assess it? I think a lot of times they don't stop to say, well, this isn't working, or this is working, but we should do something differently. And I think the most important thing that the organizers don't always consider is, what does their show really contribute to the current, the present, or to the future of the hobby in general? It's all very good to do your thing in isolation, but really you need to take some cognizance and some recognition of what's going on around you. Now, I screwed up there because I used the wrong thing to change the slide, so I apologize for that. Now let's take another stakeholder, the dealers. Now, I express my bias. I've always been an advocate for the dealers. I, believe they are the most important stakeholder in every show. The dealers' interests are very, very important. Now, from a dealer's point of view, what are they looking for in a show? What is it about a show that matters to the dealers? Well, it's an opportunity to meet new clients. They can make sales in real time, and maybe even some of those clients will pay them cash. It's an opportunity for them to buy. You do see people bringing their collections to the show to buy them, but they, it's an opportunity for them to interact with other dealers. But on the downside, they, like the show organizers, have ever increasing costs. The cost of travel, the cost of hotels, meals, the cost to take a table progressively is going up, and that inflation will come to hit those costs. More and more, the dealers are increasing their sales online rather than in person. And going back to that schedule about how you schedule shows, if you take this was from the APS website. It's not a brilliant picture, but look at all those solid blue lines. Every weekend, we have shows after shows. Many of those shows are not, from the dealer's perspective, organized with recognition of how the dealers can schedule their time and how they can optimize attending different shows. I ask a rhetorical question. The dealers, they go to these shows, but when do they actually get the time to refresh their inventory? When do the dealers actually service their online clients if there are all these shows every weekend? When do the dealers complete their office work? When do they file their sales tax returns? When do they do all of those things that need to be done in the office? They arrive on a Thursday, they're there Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they've got to get home. The week is more than half gone in many cases. Another stakeholder, the exhibitors. So let's ask a question. What is special about a World Series of Philately stamp show? What's special about it? Well, and this was an interesting topic when we were talking about it this morning, because we had some of the judges here and some of the people involved with AAPE. There is a perception that the shows have a certain standard. They're accredited. The judges have a certain experience. They've gone through an apprenticeship program. They're experienced. They're knowledgeable. Exhibitors get feedback. They get judges' critique. The shows have to have a certain number of frames. They have to have they can only have a certain number of one frames, multiple frames. And of course, the grand award winner is expected to go to the CFCs. So, from the exhibitor's point of view, they're a pretty important, in their mind, stakeholder in the shows. But let's take a breath and let's think about that group of exhibitors. APS currently has, and Scott, you can correct me if I'm wrong, about 27,000 members as of now. And in, I think, your report from Sacramento, and I hope I got this right, you said about 80% are over the age of 60. That's the APS membership. Now, if we look at exhibitors drawn from the pool of APS members, I believe you have to still be an APS member to show at a WSP show. I believe that's still correct. I speculated that, well, the number is well under 1,000 exhibitors. Talking to Ken Nielsestum, who's one of the officers at AAPE, he said currently their membership is approximately, hang on, I've just got to let people in.
You don't have to be an APS member to be to exhibit at a WSP show. Some shows may require it, but many, even the APS show doesn't require it.
Okay. Okay. But
the
let me
vast
go.
majority are.
Okay. All right. But let me go back to Ken's comment, which was very interesting because it kind of quantified things a little bit. AAPE's current membership is about 650, well under 1,000. Of the 650, about 450 to 500 are in the US and the rest are overseas. So in terms of exhibiting, we have a pretty small cadre of exhibitors. And yet, if you take a step back, and I'm not expressing a dogma about this, but we devote a huge amount of resources and we listen a lot to the exhibitors, and the exhibitors have a pretty hefty influence on shows, exhibitions, and a lot of what goes on. One might ask, is that a fair allocation of resources? I'm sure everybody would have different perspectives. A disproportionate resources devoted to exhibiting? Maybe. We're catering to a fairly small group of people. One could argue that the exhibitors do not really cover the costs that the shows bear. The storage, the assembly of the frames, the setting up of the floor space, all of those things are a cost that really the frame fees don't cover. Storage and assembly of frames, judges' expenses, medals, awards dinner. And yet the irony is very few people actually stop to look at those exhibits. And perhaps also ironically, most of those exhibits are not generally understandable to the public, the visitors, to the casual person coming to the shows. So there's a question, what is the purpose of the exhibits and the devoted space, the devoted resources to those exhibits? It's an interesting question to speculate, is that necessarily the best use of resources, or are there other ways in which one can satisfy the needs of the exhibitors whilst also taking into account the interests of the other stakeholders? Now let's take the visitor's perspective. Well, the first one is Marianne's group of the collector. He comes to buy stamps. Then there are the collectors who come to socialize, expand their horizons, meet friends, to socialize. The visitors might also be members of specialist societies who come to meet their fellow specialists. They might attend lectures and seminars. And you also have the person who's coming to learn something about stamp collecting, whether they're a youth or just a beginner collector. And again, the question is, how much are their interests represented in the way shows are structured? Now, here's again a slide which evoked some discussion this morning, and that was the question, doesn't it feel like every stamp show is just the same? Every show is basically the same dealers, the same structure of exhibits, the same mandated rules, an awards banquet. Okay, some shows have a bigger attendance, some shows have a smaller attendance. Some venues are more interesting than others. But at the end of the day, when did you last attend a WSP show and say, wow, this is different. This is really special. Interesting, and next door to the Milcopex, there's a gaming show. And the room is full. It's young people, it's old people, it's men, it's women, and they're all smiling and happy and having a great time. You contrast that with a stamp show, there are far fewer people. They are less diverse. Let's leave it at that. And there's an electricity in that gaming room which has not translated through into the stamp show. COVID came along, and COVID changed so many things, for better, for worse. It was a lot of in-person events were shut down. The world stopped. People stopped traveling. In-person events stopped. And potentially this was an opportunity for reflection and perhaps to have said, well, you know, we've been doing what we've been doing for a very long time. How can we move forward? How can we evolve? How can we adjust to the changed world around us? And the sad part is that as COVID has gone into remission, or it's mutated, or it's done whatever it's doing, in a sense, we've kind of missed the boat on evolving and changing, because we've started to see kind of the old program reestablished. Things have kind of gone back to the way they were before. Maybe some of those shows that closed up because of COVID should have been buried and forgotten. There is an argument that we just today have too many shows too close together, and that really the number of shows is disproportionate to the current state of the hobby. One could also argue that, unlike some of the countries overseas, we have not fully grasped the benefit of virtual exhibiting. Virtual exhibiting in India, in Pakistan, in Australia, in many other parts of the world, they've really taken virtual exhibiting and done many successful things. We had Philately in India. We had the Abraham Accords exhibition between State of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the US. I mean, there are so many ways we can move forward with the virtual forum. And in a sense, we haven't really said, how can we take advantage of all this new technology of Zoom, of the virtual format? So in a sense, we've maybe missed a boat. Now, some people, and especially some of the judges, are very much against virtual exhibiting. You know, they keep asking the question, well, does the exhibitor own all the items he shows? Well, it was very interesting. Dan Walker this morning in the earlier session said, as an experienced judge, you can tell if something's, you know, not right. You kind of have a sense, a feeling that this exhibit does not necessarily comprise items that the exhibitor owns. It comes from experience. So it's kind of a spurious argument. Then there's the whole discussion about condition. Well, you know, behind perspex, behind a hood mount, you can't always assess the condition in the real sense either. One of the great quotes, which I will not say which judge said it, but maybe about 18 months ago, one judge said that he really didn't like virtual judging because he found he spent too much time judging, too much time judging exhibits. I found that kind of a very interesting perspective. One of the issues is that judging a virtual show, you're kind of working individually, not as a team. Ken Nielsen, again this morning, he was the chief judge here at Milcopex. He said, well, you know, one of the things we did before the judging started, we had a Zoom meeting of all the judges, and we went through together collectively the title pages and the synopses, and we discussed them before we came to the show. So there are ways in which you can adjust for the lack of a team judging. It doesn't have to be a negative. Face-to-face contact with the exhibitors. Well, we have Zoom, we have WhatsApp, we have all of these means of communication. You can actually talk to an exhibitor, even if he were overseas, even if he's on the other side of the country, you can talk to them face-to-face virtually. So really, a lot of the arguments against virtual exhibiting really don't negate the validity of it. Now, what would be really, from one perspective, a way forward? Well, in an article in the Flash magazine, gosh, I think it's almost 2 years ago, I said really the way forward is a hybrid. We want a hybrid between the real in-person and the virtual. Combine the strengths of each. It allows for more flexibility. Another aspect which could be incorporated into this hybrid model is to look at the German and Swiss models of strong local, regional, and national shows. One of the things in Europe is with strong local shows, you encourage new exhibitors. It's more easy to get a new exhibitor to participate in a local show than it is necessary to get them to jump in the deep end at a full national show. Maybe the argument is that we should be looking to move to a smaller number of in-person World Series shows in viable, accessible, and cost-effective venues. Have a greater dealer participation, cut down on the number of shows, and encourage more dealers to attend those smaller number of shows. Perhaps one might look at 6 venues. I suggest 6 on the slide here: Belfont, Chicago, Denver, Florida, San Francisco. Why do I say Belfont? Well, the ML Society, the UN Society have had very successful shows at Belfont. It would encourage more people to come to the APS center. Perhaps that would have benefits. Now, again, criteria for qualifying for WSP shows. Maybe we could look at different criteria for showing virtually, different criteria for an in-person show. It's great to know you don't have to be an APS member. That's wonderful. That's good. I honestly hadn't thought about that question for a long time, but it's good to know. Bringing together frames and virtually. Perhaps this also allows us to cut the duration of shows. There was a very interesting discussion at the AAPE meeting yesterday about the benefits of 2-day shows versus 3-day shows. If in fact some of your judging or all of your judging was done virtually, transitioning a show from 3 days to 2 days becomes much, much more practical. It cuts the costs. I know with Milcopex, there's some discussion about next year trying to do a 3-day show versus a 2-day show and the relative costs of doing so. I hate to keep talking about cost and money and whatever, but it's a very important aspect of shows and organizing shows. GAS, the Great American Stamp Show. I confess I'm not a lover of the name GAS, but hey, that was the name that was chosen. Maybe it becomes the highlight of the WSP program. August, I'm not a great lover of August. Why am I not a great lover of August? Well, August, lots of other things are happening. The kids have gone back to school. It's an expensive travel time. I asked the question, and it's a question, it's not a statement. Is August necessarily the best time to have the major show of the year? Another question, and it's a question, is the current concept of the Champion of Champions, just comprising the winners of each grand award, necessarily the best way to recognize the premier philatelist, the premier exhibit of a year? Are there other ways that we might look at it? Just because the CFCs has been structured this way for decades, maybe there are other ways we could look at how you structure that aspect of competitive philately. There was a discussion again this morning about the old winter show that the APS used to have and how it was a money loser. It lost money. Maybe the GASS could be combined with an annual virtual exhibition that replaces what used to be that winter show. So you have the summer and the winter, the virtual and the in-person. It's an idea. I mean, there are many, many ideas that we could be looking at, that we could be exploring, that we could be talking about. And one of the problems is, unless you start a dialogue and unless you start looking some years ahead, you can have a crisis that comes along. A stamp show has its frames and they set them up and they're not going to work. What do? They've reached a crisis point. Part of the problem is the shows have gone on and they've continued and continued and continued, but we haven't necessarily reevaluated what we're doing. And I realize that many of the shows are autonomous, but there does need to be some overall overarching discussion about how those shows might work together, how the program of events could be coordinated better. I think there are some hard choices coming, hard choices in many directions. Should we be cutting the capacity? If we were an airline, we'd cut flights, we'd cut capacity, we'd use smaller planes. Maybe given the current state of the market, we should be eliminating and modifying some of those weaker shows. Maybe we should be concentrating resources to create bigger and more impactful events. I was talking to Dan about Comic-Con. You compare a stamp show with Comic-Con. Comic-Con has impact. The coin shows, the American Numismatic Association, their shows have impact. Many of our shows don't really have impact. They don't have a wow factor. Taking the dealers into account, maybe it would help dealers adjust their budgets, lower their expenses. And if we get more people at the shows, hopefully they start to make more sales. Collectors would benefit if we get more dealers at the shows. From the exhibiting point of view, and this again evoked quite a bit of discussion this morning with the judges, and today exhibiting is, there's a lot of red tape. You got to produce a title page. You got to produce a synopsis. A lot of it is very regulated. And I would suggest that this might discourage a lot of new exhibitors. If in fact we open up the local and the regional shows with less red tape, less formalization, maybe we can encourage more people. If you had a meeting of, say, the Bermuda Study Group at a local or regional show, members of that study group could mount exhibits in the frames, but they are not constrained by the requirements of a competitive exhibit. They could take pages from their album and put them in the frames and have them evaluated if they wished, or not evaluated if they didn't wish. We could open up more flexibility, more encouragement to get participation. If we adopt more of a virtual format, we could even encourage participation in shows in the United States from overseas. We were originally hoping at Milcopex to have a number of thematic exhibits from India. Unfortunately, the Philately Congress of India wouldn't help the person who was going to bring the exhibits complete a lot of the export paperwork. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get that participation. If we would have been able to incorporate a virtual element, we were going to have over 50 frames of exhibits where we would have had images, we could have printed them out and put them in the frames, and they could have been judged on the same basis as physical exhibits in those frames. If there was a little more flexibility, then we would have greater participation and everything, I think, would be more encouraging to potential exhibitors. A couple of bottom line throwaway comments. In some ways they're throwaway, but in others they're deadly serious. I think the current model long-term is probably not sustainable. Change is almost certainly inevitable. We have to embrace it and we have to plan for it. We don't want to end up in a crisis where things start to go wrong. The purpose, to go back to repeat myself, I guess this is the epilogue. The purpose of this is not to provide answers. It's to say, really, it's time we started to have some discussion. It's time we started to be looking at things from more of a long-term perspective. We need a dialogue. We need the shows to be talking to each other. We need the shows to be discussing the issues that they have in common and trying to reach some answers. So at that point, I've kind of said what I had to say. I'm sure most of you will not agree with everything I said. Many of you will probably disagree strongly with some of the things I've said. But the idea is to initiate a discussion. And for that, I'm grateful to Marianne. It was her idea. I take the blame for anything and everything I said. What do people think? Do you want to unmute yourselves? Do you want to express some ideas? Earl, we have Earl Toops sitting in the room and he has some points of view. Right.
are we maybe teasing and all sorts of standalone isolated things for a show? I realize that, doing shopping malls are dying tomorrow in the US too, but when there's security problems and all that, are we looking at the normal type venue?
Okay.
And in the Omaha, the societies, Haiti, Liberia, Esther, Ethiopia, they put teams out to the local university and colleges, to try and draw them in, to, again, come and listen to the lectures and the presentations. That I think we're missing the point, we're missing the aspect of the cultural history in historical research. Maybe we need to try to focus on our advertising as to who we're going to.
Right. I don't know if you could all hear what Earl was saying. Earl basically was raising 2 points, and I'll address the two of them. His first was in regards to venues for shows, and he rightly said that in the Middle East, in Qatar, in Kuwait, in UAE, and in Oman, they host their shows in shopping malls because that way the public sees the exhibits. The dealers' booths are set up in shopping malls. It's a very public, open space. It caters to that group, the visitor. It caters to the casual collector. Earl rightly says there are practical issues. There's issues of security. There's issues of insurance. There are many issues. But his question is not misplaced. It is, are we choosing always the right places in which to have a show? How do we cater to those interest groups in the different shows? And where do we satisfy the needs of the different groups? Very good question. The second aspect was about outreach. How do we promote our shows? How do we reach out? And that goes back to the visitor. How do we make people aware of a stamp show? And it goes back to how do you draw people into the hobby? And that's, again, a very good question. Our shows are our shop window. And I forget who it was. I think it was Wayne Youngblood this morning said that in peak Philately, every town had its stamp shop. And the stamp shop was the entry point for many, many people into the hobby. And today, with the disappearance of the stamp stores, the stamp shops in most cases are all gone. The stamp show is potentially the next best thing. So in a sense, how do you transition the show to fulfill, to the best of its ability, the role of the stamp show in the past? And that, again, is an important question. How do the shows successfully perform the role of the local stamp shop historically? I don't know, do people have opinions on that? Apparently not.
Well, I dare say 90% of your show attendees are coming for the bourse. I mean, that's where they see people they don't see to buy from. They probably only see them once a year, unless it's an unusual situation. And the majority of them are coming to see the dealers. Everything else to them is just fluff on top. I mean, it's basically, other than online buying, the only source where they're going to expand their collections as a rule right now. I mean, like you say, the brick and mortar stamp shops are gone. They've been gone for 20 years or more. And a well-populated bourse, and one that's thought out by the committee putting it on, can bring dealers into the area that these people usually don't see, and get a chance to see material or obtain material that they ordinarily might not have a source for. So the majority of our showgoers are there to buy, to expand their collections, basically.
So would there not be an argument that I use the term provocative, we create a divorce between exhibitions and bourses, and we say our competitive, our exhibiting should be done in one set of venues, in one structure, and the bourses take place in a parallel universe? Is it necessarily the optimal solution to put the two together? Are you thinking, Daryl, or are you?
If you take out the exhibition portion, you're also ruling out a lot of people who are most active in the hobby. It's a double-edged sword. Yes, the majority of the showgoers don't look at the exhibits or look at them briefly and move on. At the same time, most all of those people that are putting in the exhibits are the most active in the hobby and do a lot to support or volunteer or whatever it shows. If we're going to tell them, well, exhibiting is going to be divorced from the bourses and it's only going to be in whatever format we say, I think you're going to start hurting shows even more by siphoning off participants, ones that are truly active and more than just coming in, buy a few stamps and go back out.
Well,
Because
then the question,
the exhibitors are a minority in the hobby for sure. But when you look at what they do more than just exhibit, you'll find out that they're probably the most active in the hobby also.
well, let me ask you a question, I hear what you say. When you say active, can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by active?
There we go. More than likely, they volunteer at their own show if they have one. They try. They are the ones that are making up seminars. They are the ones that are committed to being more than just a collector in the hobby, that kind of thing. I mean, that's not to say that if we took it out and put exhibiting up somewhere else, nebulous as that definition is, a show bourse wouldn't necessarily die if the community was strong enough there to support it. But it's going to take some of your more active people out of a lot of activities, I would think. Now, I could be wrong, but I still think there is a place for exhibiting. And as you pointed out, the economic model of it has never made money.
Right.
We can't charge enough to exhibitors to cover the cost of actually putting that frame on the floor. I mean, if we did, we'd be charging $100, $150 a frame.
Interesting. This morning, they came up with 65.
It depends on the show.
Yeah.
If you don't have storage costs for the frames, there's a lot of factors that go into that.
Yeah.
If you truly have volunteers still that can put up frames, you've still got to bring in a jury. I think 65 is probably very conservative. I mean, based on what I saw at Milcopex for years,
Right.
I mean, and most shows are still only charging no more than $10 a frame.
Right.
One frames are a separate story, but you can't, you're not even pretending to break even at $10 a frame.
Right.
Phil Steger actually wrote an article in the AAPE probably 20 plus years ago. And I believe even then he came up with a number of over $60 20 years ago per
Oh,
frame.
yeah.
Right. Well, I think
Um,
Milcopex is lucky because they don't have to pay for storage, which is a big benefit, I think.
Right, see, that cuts
Some-
your costs right there.
Right. Now, somebody posted a question about what did the dealers actually say this morning? And I will be blunt. They didn't have a lot to say. The dealers, I hesitate to say the dealers kind of, a lot of them are like a deer in the headlights. They just keep doing what they've done. And well, that's what they've always done. And they don't really seem to either have an opinion or want to express an opinion on anything. Maybe they're just totally happy. I wonder. I mean, I walked around the show this morning and Rob Hennick is sitting here and he'll probably curse me for saying this, but the attendance on the first day was abysmal. Oh, okay. Rob is saying that the attendance has been abysmal all 3 days. So I wonder.
Is it their new venue?
The new venue is beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. It is head and shoulders far above the old Crown Plaza, which was disgusting. And it is beyond any comparison with that one show that they had many years ago at the showground, which I think was the ultimate pits. That was the worst Milcopex. Sorry, Rob. That was the worst Milcopex I've ever been to. But this venue is gorgeous. There's a hotel right next door. It's got bright light. It's got high ceilings. It's gorgeous. There's free car parking, but a lack of people. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I think at least in my mind, one of the things that I think would be a really productive thing would be for some forum of discussion where one can hear perspectives from different shows, different interest groups, and really think about the long-term prospects, planning, long-term vision for shows. I think, we're at a point where we really need to start to be honest about the problems that we're facing. And I don't lay the blame at exhibiting or the dealers or the organizers or the collectors. Collectively, we've been doing something for a very long time, and the attendees have shrunk. Shows are desperate for exhibits. We have some problems, and a discussion about how we should be looking to the future, I think, is certainly the way to go. And I don't think it's for the individual shows to try to solve all the problems on their own. I think it's a collective issue that affects us all. And no one show has a magic bullet. But at least if we start to have a dialogue and to discuss it, then hopefully 5 years from now, we will have a sustainable model that works, that's viable and commercially satisfies each of the different groups.
So, Colin, I want to just pipe in for a second. Fortunately, you're sitting down, so when I say this, you won't fall down. And that is, I agree with pretty much everything you laid out. I'm
really disappointed. I'm really disappointed.
For some folks in this conversation, they've heard this from me. And, as I indicated to you privately in an email, and I will say publicly for whoever's there to hear it, that there are several issues with the show that I think need to be addressed. You use Comic-Con as an example of that. And then bouncing off of Daryl's comment that 90% of the people that come to the show are coming to the Bourse. I don't disagree with either one of those points. However, if you look at Comic-Con, if you go to a Comic-Con, what you'll realize is that the dealers are in a very small venue separate from the Comic-Con that you see on TV. And the reason for that is because you're bringing them for an entirely separate reason. For instance, if a new Marvel movie is coming out, then Paul Feig is there to explain to you exactly what that is. The phrase we use is fear of missing out, FOMO. And what precisely is the show going to bring? So I'll give you an example of an idea. That is, you have all of these wonderful exhibitors that are going to put their exhibit in, say, Milcopex, for instance. And let's ask that exhibitor is going to come to the show. They may go to the banquet. They'll probably visit with a few dealers, may even sit in on a couple of different things. But I mean, if you have an exhibitor like, say, an Alfredo Froelich or a Gordon Eubanks that's coming to Milwaukee, you've got someone that's got experience, knowledge, and a collection that most people in the greater Milwaukee area have never seen. Why not impose on them a bit to use some of that time to explain that exhibit, to explain their research, what went behind that exhibit, in a talk that I think would draw collectors in, because it would be a unique moment for them to meet someone that's got a collection they're not going to lay eyes on again for some time. So there's an idea, but I mean, there's a million of these that we need to actually hash through and think through. I agree with you. I think the number of World Series shows is too great. I believe that if we don't plan ahead and rather we sit here passively and wait for World Series and Philately shows to fall on their own, that we're going to have a bigger problem than if we were able to help gently guide this process a bit to figure out how to maintain the uniqueness of what a World Series of Philately event is. I do believe virtual exhibiting's got a place in U.S. exhibiting, and it's woefully been undercapitalized right now and underutilized. And I'd like to be able to get some support for that as well. So there's I mean, I don't disagree with virtually anything you've laid out in your presentation. I'm short on solutions like you. And, you know, I need to build a group of people that can buy into this, because sadly, change implemented is often done without open arms. And so I need some help, or else I'm in trouble, because sooner or later you all will figure out a reason to run me out of this hobby. And so I am trying my best to move into place people that I think can help us do that.
Well, I think I agree with you. I think you need a consensus. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm very opinionated, and I think most of the people on the thing at the moment know that I'm very opinionated. I also unquestionably have the interests of the dealers to heart. That's where I come from. But I also collect, I also exhibit, I also judge. But first and foremost, I really have the best interests of the trade at heart. Your comment about Gordon Eubanks giving talks, I actually think that's a brilliant idea. And for many years, I've been telling different people on the FIP board that the exhibitors in the championship class, in addition to putting their exhibit in the championship class, should be required to make at least a 1-hour oral presentation on their exhibit, on their collection, for the judges and for the public. And perhaps this might help to smooth the process of selecting the Grand Prix winners at international shows. Perhaps that's also something that could be incorporated into the CFCs, that each CFC participant is required to, in addition to his exhibit, make an oral presentation. And now with Zoom and with all the virtual communication, that's a practical thing to do. And I think, again, it might help in the selection process of the CFCs. I think your idea is brilliant. Rob Hennick is questioning the practicality of the judges having to listen to 30 hours of lectures. Maybe an hour might be a little too long for CFCs. But you could narrow it to, say, if you selected a group of candidates and the candidates were required to make an oral presentation, that might cut it down to 3 or 4 hours. But as people say, sometimes they spend too long judging virtual exhibits. So, you know,
front of you, you aren't standing and having to get through something in 10 minutes. Something starts getting interesting, and so you spend more time on it. You go more in depth into it. Coaches will often be trained in how to distinguish between and get critique and actual coaching.
Right, right. What I don't know if you could all hear what Rob was saying. Rob was saying about, you know, the difference between an AAP critique and a judging of an exhibit. And the critique is a far more time-consuming thing than a judging process. And there's a very clear distinction between the two. Steve, did you have any other questions, thoughts? Luis Fernando, did you have any thoughts?
Colin, I had one thought.
Thoughts only.
There appears to be tremendous variation in the way that shows so far have tried virtual exhibiting. The gas in 2021, I think, had a tremendously well done virtual exhibit. The one in India, for instance, had a terrible one where you couldn't get close-ups of the material. So would you be moving along to recommending a suggested set of guidelines or technical bottom limit for what can be done?
I think you have to. I think you have to have standardization. You have to have standardization, certain DPIs, certain formats, and you also need templates for. I'm sure there's a different word for it. Templates where the material is presented when you go to the screen and you actually pull up. You can pull up the pages. You can pull up the frames. Things do need to be standardized, and I'm sure in the standardization process, certain people's sentiments might get upset because their format is not adopted. But you know what? The video industry dealt with it with Betamax and what was the other? Betamax and VHS. They dealt with it. We can deal with that. It's really, you come up with a format, you come up with a standard set that works. And kind of like scanning for libraries, you know, libraries have to find a way to work together in scanning so that things are standardized. If we are going to go down the road internationally with virtual exhibiting, we do need to coordinate with what they want to do in China, what they want to do in Europe. And so that people can move their exhibit between different geographic regions without having to rescan it, without having to reformat it. It's just a fact of life. You need to set in place a consistent set of standards, and that's not hard to do.
Well,
but some people will
Manage has
benefit.
already put out some guidelines for virtual shows. They were very generic because shows are still figuring out what they can and can't do in a practical sense. And there will probably be more coming out of Canage about virtual shows. The bottom line on most virtuals is, though, the show committees we have now, I would say 95% of them do not have the technical expertise, smarts, whatever you want to call it, or resources to do a virtual exhibit.
Well, but that's where you share resources. You know, for Denver, we asked the man from Pipex, whose name totally escapes me, and I cannot think of somebody who is more willing to help, more keen to share his expertise. You put together a team, a technical team who understand and can advise and help the shows. The thing I would counsel Canage on the standardization, it can't just be an internal US standardization. The standardization has to be international. Canage needs to reach out to comparable bodies overseas to ensure that the standards are uniform internationally. That's the one thing I would counsel. You know, the US can't just perform on its own. It needs to perform in synchronization with other countries. And this is an area where you do need that concordance between different countries. Rob was making a very patriotic statement there. Well, gentlemen, I can say gentlemen, there are no, unfortunately, ladies present. Do anybody else have any other thoughts? And Scott, one thing I would ask you, and I invite you, let's find a way forward where we can continue these dialogues, continue sharing these ideas, and try and start to move forward. You know, please, you know, let's start to think through some of these issues collectively.
Definitely so. And I put some of this on Daryl. There will be some other work that we do separate from CANage, but some of this is going to go to that committee to look at, to think about. And I praise Daryl for opening up the CANage committee to more than just exhibitors. He wants to also invite those who have knowledge of the shows as well as the dealer side of things. So the diversity that he's putting on that committee is a welcome approach to the way that we've got to go about doing this.
Good, good. Anand, I think you had a comment that you wanted to raise.
If I can, if I'm allowed
absolutely.
to. Just one suggestion. Few years back in COVID, in CPEX, I have exhibited online, and that was a fabulous show. That was the virtual show. They arranged very good. And one more point, if not virtual, and if it is a physical exhibition, I had an issue recently in Milcopex, Austria. I can't take my exhibit to Austria, but they allowed me to put my Xerox copy, color copy. So in that case, if you have some physical exhibition, you can put color copy of the exhibit from overseas who can't send you exhibits. That's a just option, just the idea. In Milcopex, they put my exhibit, all 8 frames, with color prints, and it works. I was not able to bring my exhibit to Austria because of certain issues of Indian custom and all. So they allow me to put my color Xerox over there. In that case, if you have very good exhibit from overseas, you can put the color Xerox. So physical exhibit can be, people can enjoy. Just a thought.
Right. Well, we had a similar issue in Dubai back in January with the international show. The Indian commissioner, I believe, tested positive for COVID when he was about to board his flight. And the show committee, I think, took the right decision that they took electronic versions of the exhibits, printed them out, mounted the color scans, and they were judged as if they were original material. The fortunate thing is it was not an FIP show, so the organizing committee was able to use the wisdom of Solomon and make the right decision. There are cases where it makes sense to do that, to use printed versions. And I think it goes back to something that I think we need to learn to be a little more flexible. We need to not always be as dogmatic. And where situations arise where you need some flexibility, you exercise it.
That will give you a chance to, people can see a very good exhibit. If you, just a thought.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all for attending. Scott, thank you very much. It's encouraging to hear that you are turning your focus onto some of these issues. And as I say, I look forward to seeing progress. So thank you all for attending. I'm going to try and close the meeting and stop the recording. So thank you all for attending, and I will try and switch things off to the best of my ability with Zoom, which is very limited.